Welcome back to Inside Story. Abbas, Olmert and Rice, they've become a familiar trio, all claiming to have peace at the top of their agendas. And Dr. Rice's latest trip sees all three of them in the middle of their own dilemmas. A rash of corruption scandals have overshadowed Olmert's premiership. He denies any wrongdoing, but critics have called his commitment to peace a PR stunt designed to lift his wilting popularity in Israel. Since Hamas seized Gaza in June, Abbas has found himself presiding over only half the Palestinian territories. Hamas has also warned Abbas that if he is to strike a deal with Israel, they will simply not recognise it. This is Rice's seventh visit to Israel and Palestinian this year, but so far she has very little to show for it. She has Abbas and Olmert talking to each other. We've agreed that's a big step forward. But US efforts are concentrated on Iran and Iraq these days, and with US elections coming up next year, her attention may well be on other things. Our guests are still with us. Let's go to Paul Asham, first of all, in Washington, D.C. Does Mr. Bush need a Middle East peace plan just as his lasting legacy?
He would like to have one, but I don't think there is a lot of illusion that this will be some sort of final settlement. He would like to have something positive in the Middle East. There's no reason to believe that Iraq will be much better by the time he leaves office. So if this can be put back on a track, then it's some degree of a positive legacy, and I think it's clear that this is a large part of what's driving this effort.
Gerald Steinberg talking to us from Jerusalem. We have Ehud Olmert recognised as possibly one of the weakest prime ministers, certainly from his political position, that Israel's had in a very long time. Whatever he signs, can it stick? Will it go down with the Israeli public? Is it going to be something that lasts?
Well, I don't think he's going to sign very much. We're talking about some sort of declaration, and that's going to be very controversial. But Olmert has a very firm majority in the Knesset. Most members of the Knesset do not want to go to new elections, and therefore they're willing to swallow a great deal. Now, if there are mass demonstrations, if there's a huge demonstration against compromise in Jerusalem because of the fear that will go right back to the period between 49 and 67, where Jews weren't even allowed to set foot in their holy sites, when there was mass desecration, if those are the types of terms that the Israeli public sees that Olmert is bringing back, there will be mass demonstrations, and that just as in some ways that contributed to the fall of the Barak government, that could also be dangerous for Olmert. So I don't think he's going to do that. He's a master politician. If we hear more of the rhetoric that unfortunately we just heard from Rassan, the old rhetoric about international law and a very careful picking and choosing and the total distortion, if there's no movement on the Palestinians to say, we understand that this conflict, both of us bear responsibility, there are many Israeli dead, many Israelis suffered, Palestinians suffered, so we're not going to try to undo all of this by refugee claims and other things. Let's start a new beginning. We're going to compromise pragmatically. That will help Olmert. If we hear the old rhetoric, the old very picking and choosing from all sorts of claims of Security Council resolutions, that's going to slam the door. Israelis are going to say, these are the same old Palestinians who've been playing this rejectionist game for decades, and there's really nothing to talk about. The issue of refugee claims and accepting a two-state solution and not trying to rewrite the history of the Arab invasion and rejectionism all the way back to 47, if that doesn't happen, there just is nothing to talk about. The Israeli public will absolutely reject that. And here I disagree with Paul Schramm, or at least I disagree perhaps with some of the suggestions that he made. I don't think the Israeli public is going to in any way accept rewriting of history. There were thousands of Israelis who've been killed through Arab rejectionism since 1947, well over 1,000 murdered since 2001. Israelis are not going to somehow say, well, we're going to accept the Palestinian version and we're going to give up our version of justice and history. It's got to be compromise on both sides.
Compromise on both sides, and yet we're hearing from both of you in Ramallah and Jerusalem that there are red lines that your people will not allow you to cross. That somehow has to change. Let me ask Hassan al-Khatib, how powerful, how influential is Mahmoud Abbas at the moment when he probably represents maybe only half of the Palestinian people?
Well, Mahmoud Abbas is not in a very strong position. However, the political process is partially meant to empower the peace camp in Palestine, because as we all know, the failure of the peace process and the unilateral approach of the previous Israeli government was responsible for the radicalization process and the weakness of the peace camp in Palestine, because the peace camp failed to deliver ending the occupation by peaceful means in the eyes of the Palestinian people. Now there is a hope that the resumption of the peace process and any progress in the peace process will empower the peace camp in Palestine and help Mahmoud Abbas resuming his authority, his legitimate authority over the Palestinian people and territories. The problem here is that the continuity of the Israeli practices that are about consolidating the occupation, like the settlement expansion that we saw until last week, does not fit with the positive news about renewal of a peace process and efforts to end the occupation, because the political negotiations are about ending the occupation. The settlement expansion is about consolidating the occupation. The two are incompatible. And in order to help Mahmoud Abbas reassuring his political position, there has to be harmony between the Israeli practices, i.e. stopping the expansion of settlement, and the political process which is supposed to help Olmert and Abbas and Bush at the end of the day.
All right, let's turn this around slightly, because I was going to ask you if you could take Mahmoud Abbas to one side and suggest one thing that he really needs to pursue. What would it be? But I'm going to ask you, Hassan, if you could take Ehud Olmert to one side and give him one message, what would it be?
I think that Ehud Olmert should be advised to take into consideration the internal situations of Mahmoud Abbas, and I would say the same to Mahmoud Abbas, because both are supposed to be partners in this political process, and the failure is going to be harmful for the two. And in terms of what Olmert is supposed to do, Olmert is supposed to be more sensitive to the internal needs of Mahmoud Abbas that has no reflection on the Israeli most sensitive issue, which is security. And in this regard, stopping the illegal expansion of settlements will have no negative security implications on Israel. Actually, the expansion of settlements increases the security burden on Israel. That will be an extremely positive signal that will empower Mahmoud Abbas, and that will give a significant push to the peace process.
Gerald Steinberg, you've got Mahmoud Abbas's ear. What do you say to him?
Take some risks. I know it's very difficult, but take some risks here in this situation and speak to your own people that will all listen at the same time, and tell your people it's time for a major change, to abandon the rejectionism, to change the textbooks, to deal with Israel as legitimate presence in the region and say, let's find a compromise. Let's find a way out of 60 years of violence and conflict for both of our good. Let's go a totally different path. Let's put everything on the table. Let's recognize we're both here to stay. We both have very, very deep roots in this region. And let's deal with the issue of refugees straight, without all the jargon around it. Let's deal with the issue of Jerusalem. Let's deal with the violence. These are our requests from the Israelis. These are the requests that we're going to ask, that we're willing to put on the table. But we as Palestinians, Mr. Abbas has to say, have to make painful compromises as well, and that we don't hear.
And Paul Sharp, in Washington, D.C., you've got a chance to talk to Condoleezza Rice. What would you say to her around about a year before an election? Would you say take a risk, or would you say, I'm sorry, it's going to be the same old story?
At this point, she has committed herself so profoundly to this that there's very little chance, I think, of calling it off. I think that she and, in some ways, even President Bush have to be very directly involved, and also to recognize that this is probably, if it's going to be successful, not going to be a one-off conference. It's not as though you're going to meet for a few days and then come to some sort of agreement. The best thing that could happen would be some sort of process, and this process will take a lot of hands-on work by the Secretary of State and occasionally the President, and the Americans will have to be involved because, as has been said, and I completely agree, both sides will have to make compromises that their populations will not be happy about. And although the Bush presidency is very, very weak, He is president for another 15 months.
And we're going to have to stop you. Paul Schaap, we're going to have to stop you there.
Freedom.
OK, we can see all three of you on the screen at least. Effectively, you're in the same room, even though it's a televisual one. Thanks for joining us on Inside Story.